I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to all of you who are joining us both physically in person today, as well as those who are joining us online. It's great to see so many people here in the room, and then, of course, see the number of people participating virtually. So my name is Ian Cochran. I'm a senior advisor at I4C, Institute for Climate Economics, and I'm also the head of the Secretariat of Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions. And I'll actually grab this so before I forget about it. And I'm really happy to be able to welcome all of you today to this event, where we'll be focusing on making climate finance work in an uncertain world. And this is an event that, at the Mainstreaming Initiative, my colleague Alice Potier and Alexis Bonnel and others, we've been talking about quite some time. How can we move this conversation forward, and how can we really get this issue out there and something that we're discussing together? And I know today we're not alone, given all the movement in this space, including the launch of the task force last month at the OECD on related topics. So we're really happy today to be able to convene this session that will really hopefully help us really see how to move forward and start to perhaps construct an agenda. And you're about to hear the COP announcement. Sorry for all the noise behind me. But while we're being told about wearing our face masks, what I'll do is just go ahead and say a couple words about our initiative for those of you who might not know us. And particularly that as of last week, we were called the Climate Action in Financial Institutions Initiative. And last week, we launched our new name, as we think it better reflects what we're doing together as a group of 50-plus public and private financial institutions dialoguing together on mainstreaming climate change into operations, into strategies, and really thinking about ensuring that the financial sector is contributing to the achievement of our long-term climate goals. So last week, we both launched our new name, our new website, and as well as a tool that helps financial institutions navigate all of the materials that are out there today, as well as the broader mainstreaming process that they might be finding themselves engaged in. So please don't hesitate to check out our site, full of resources and a lot of good stuff. And if perhaps your institution is not yet part of our initiative, we'd be happy to engage with you to talk about whether or not it would make sense, and I would say yes, of course, for you to join and join the conversations that we're having. But enough of trying to get more members. What I really want to do is introduce quickly what we're here to talk about, and that is uncertainty. So we really have a great panel today, and it's so great that we've actually divided it into two parts. So firstly, we're going to have a number of introductory remarks who are really going to shed some light on where are we today in thinking about rethinking how we use the future, how we use futures, and why it matters for climate finance. And I'll be handing over to Alexis Bonnel here in a minute to introduce both our panelists, as well as say a couple of words of introduction. And then followed by this first set of introductory remarks, we'll then hear from a number of research institutions, but also financial institutions themselves, to say a few words about how we are actually applying foresight and forward-looking scenarios in practice. And I'll go ahead and introduce my panelists once we get to that part of the session. So yeah, I think now I will hand things over to my co-host for today, Alexis Bonnel, from the French Development Agency, AFD, who of course is also co-host of our event, which I should have said from the very beginning. So Alexis, over to you.
Many thanks, Ian. That's the one working. Many thanks, Ian, and good morning, afternoon to everyone here physically present and online. I'm delighted to co-host this event with the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions Initiative today on a topic that we've been discussing for quite some time already, about the integration of future awareness and uncertainty in climate finance. And the reason why we've been discussing this for quite some time already as being a major topic for discussion this comes from two observations. Well, the first one is quite obvious. I mean, we live in a complex world, and addressing the very complex issues that we have and we are facing, and that COP here is trying to address, requires obviously long-term thinking and collective action. And surprisingly, long-term thinking and having the lenses of the future is something that we have hard times doing. Particularly in times of crisis, we usually act hastily, at best for the short term. And it is as if the futures had disappeared from our representations. I wanted to ask you to start, when was the last time you thought about the way you use the future? Maybe some of you have a response and thought about it even 2 minutes ago. Congratulations to you. But for many of us, probably not recently or maybe even never. That is surprising because, of course, since we're dealing here about long-term issues and all the COP discussions here are about the future, of course, 2025, 2030, the 2050 pathways to net zero, getting the temperature goal before the end of the century under control. All of this is very long-term thinking. And do we have the long-term lenses to address these issues? That's an open question that we will try to discuss and dig into today. Now, take finance. Well, finance is the major economic instrument today that relates us to our futures. As Keynes said, the importance of money flows from it being a link between the present and the future. And there also, quite surprisingly, not many financial institutions are practicing foresight or are fully future aware. A lot of the approaches that we are developing in the finance space are still quite deterministic and sometimes do not fully embrace all the uncertainties that we have to integrate to move forward and improve the quality of our decision making. So combining the need for long-term thinking and the power of finance, this is exactly what we would like to explore today. And to set the stage, we have a series of high-level panelists that will help us understand why this topic is so important and how finance could address it better. We will have to start with Daniel Kaplan, who is the co-founder of the Plurality University Network, and who will tell us more about how changing representations of the future can change reality and help implement climate transitions. Then we will have two prominent speakers from the OECD, and let me say a big hello to all of you. Nuncan Kasbegs, who is the Counselor for Strategic Foresight at the General Secretariat of the OECD, and also Dexter Doherty, who is a foresight analyst, also at the OECD. And we will also have the pleasure to hear remarks from Susan Roth, who is advisor and Chief of Knowledge Advisory Services Center at the Asian Development Bank. And I will get back to that towards the end of the session, but it so happens that the OECD is co-hosting a task force on foresight for sustainable development finance that the Asian Development Bank and AFD are co-facilitating. And if you stay with us till the end, we will let you know a little more about it as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor now to Daniel Kaplan to tell us more about why the future is so important and why we need to change our representations of the future. Daniel, the floor is yours.
And apologies, maybe just on a quick logistical note, I have the clicker, so please say next slide when you'd like the slides to be advanced. And then also for everyone participating online and in the room, we do hope to have time for question and answer at the end. So please either think of your questions now, note them down if you're here physically, or go ahead even now and pop them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that, and we'll see, hopefully we'll have time to get to everything at the end of the different sessions. So yes, now Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Alexi. Thanks for having me. So really quickly, Foresight. It's an activity where you basically use the future in order to make better decisions in the present. Uh, it's a diverse activity, and what I'd like to show you first is that typical Foresight goals or reasons why you will use the future result in first different methods, of course, but also very different relationships to uncertainty itself, which is the topic of our discussion. You can use Foresight for strategic planning, and that would be maybe to ground decisions in order to give them the highest likelihood of producing the desired effect. Here, the goal would be to sort of reduce uncertainty. You can use it for risk management, to make risk as controllable, calculable, manageable as possible. And here the result would be, or the goal would be to contain uncertainty. But you can also use it for generating change, to explore new possibilities, to make sense of emerging phenomena, to innovate radically. And here, I don't know if it's the goal, but the outcome is clearly to increase uncertainty. So you'll have different kinds of uses of the future with very different relationships to uncertainty. And we at the Plurality University focus on the last category, the one that intends to generate change to, in the words of Riel Miller at UNESCO, to even change the conditions of change. This is a category which is maybe less explored than others in Foresight, and we think you should pay more attention to it, which doesn't mean you should pay less attention to other approaches, because they're all important. Why is that? Well, first of all, because, and we could, actually, I forgot to say next slide. I'm not used to asking someone to do the clicking. So just pass 2 slides, please. The first reason might be that with climate change and the accumulation, the combination of different changes and crises in the world, we may, in some cases, be beyond reducing or containing uncertainty, which would be why, if we, I don't know at what slide we are now. Okay, I'm seeing my screen. Okay, the next one. Which would be why people like 2 successive CEOs of AXA are wondering whether their activity is possible in some of those futures. If the world is uninsurable, it probably means that you can't really calculate risk, or at least, or share risks among people, and it's a very different world. The second reason is because we have a hard time realizing how different a COP21 or 26 compatible world is from today's. Imagine that world. Among other things, it's a zero emission world, or maybe a negative emissions world. We probably can't fly. Most of us don't drive cars, don't even maybe see cars. Merchandise travels much less. Less stuff is made. I could go on with that laundry list, but it doesn't really give us the big picture. How does that fit together? What does life look like in different places of the world? What are the economics or the politics of such a world? For this, quantitative measures or even technology can work on items in my laundry list. But if we focus on each of them, or if we focus separately on each SDG, for example, the positive effects that these measures will have is usually lost to rebound effects, which is basically what we've seen for the last 30 plus years. So we need more. We need to look beyond current paradigms, and paradigms are really the way in which we reason, the way in which we apply our senses, our knowledge to the world as we see it. If we want to change it, we have to change the whole representation of what reality is about. We need imagination, which is why the quote I put a little earlier that you saw for about 3 seconds is so important to me, which is Naomi Klein's and Rob Hopkins' quote saying, "Climate change is the biggest failure of imagination of humanity." We need imagination because we have no past reference as to what this world really looks like, which is why we at the Plurality University usually work with artists, designers, activists to explore transformative futures. There's also a last reason to work on imagination and imaginaries, which is dialogue and cooperation. You probably know it, top-down approaches, even virtuous top-down approaches work less and less well. Because on the ground, you deal with more and more diverse stakeholders, they become more and more assertive, and they don't necessarily agree either with you as development banks or with one another. So you need to establish dialogue and cooperation with them in interventions whose role, if you want to make them more sustainable, is to actually change the status quo in a deep way. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult is that your and their assumptions on the future, which are often unsaid, maybe sometimes unconscious, about what's possible, about what's desirable, are so different. For some, it's still about development as simple economic growth. For others, it's about many different things, sometimes more related to sustainability. Becoming conscious of our and others' anticipatory assumptions is what UNESCO calls futures literacy. It's a core capability that you need to develop not only within your organization, but to share with the people you work with or intend to work with on the ground, if you intend to change what and who you support. So to finish, how can that translate into your activities? I'm not a finance person. Thank you for clicking without me asking you to. But here are maybe some possible directions. The first one is clearly to learn to create dialogue and cooperation by developing your and your interlocutors' futures literacy and exploring ways to reveal and change imaginaries about the future, to picture in your mind and those of your partners what the world, or at least their part of the world, would look like if you were to cooperate in the right directions. But it's also to take risks, different kinds of risks. Maybe dedicate a small percentage of your resources to weird, uncertainty raising projects, usually small ticket projects, but with maybe big symbolic or real effect on the ground. Finance alternatives, finance the Zapatistas or autonomous zones, finance open source, finance innovation that generates no intellectual property but spreads and adapts. And I know so many entrepreneurs who want to open source their inventions and can't do it because they don't find the finance. Finance resilience, meaning risk readiness where risk is incalculable. Support maybe emerging alternatives for industries whose very existence is in question: air travel, automobile, insurance. So just to summarize what I wanted to share with you. The first one is change that doesn't increase uncertainty is not change. The second one is that we may be beyond risk reduction, containment, and calculation. And so we need to look at approaches that do away with those. The third one is that if we want a +2 degrees Celsius world and not more, it's a deeply different world from the one that we know today. And we won't have it if we can't imagine it. And we can't imagine it from our office towers. We need to build it with the people, and that means considerable change in probably how you and we work together. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was very interesting and probably also somewhat disruptive for financial institutions to hear that indeed we should increase or consider the increase of uncertainty, and that change without more uncertainty is not change. And I think that that is a very interesting message that we could reflect upon. Now I would like to turn to our OECD colleagues, Duncan and Dexter. If you could share with us the thoughts around foresight seen from the OECD. And I know OECD has been very active these past few years in promoting a better use of the futures throughout all of what you do, both at policymaking, but also in your relation with financial institutions. So over to you, Duncan or Dexter. I don't know who would like to start.
Okay,
Duncan.
well, greetings all. Thank you very much for this invitation and for setting up this this very useful event. And it's great to see all of these colleagues around the table. So my name is Duncan, and my colleague Dexter and I are going to tell you a little bit about a project that we've been working on within from the Strategic Foresight Unit within the OECD, as with a number of our colleagues across the organization, which has really been about asking the question, how can we bring strategic foresight to contribute to this issue of the broader issue of addressing climate, as well as building a more just and prosperous and sustainable future, particularly in the context of net zero transitions. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just run you through a little bit of the genesis, the ideas for this really, is that we asked ourselves, well, what are of the variety of ways that foresight could be useful in this context? What is the niche that we would like to most, in a very busy field in which there's a tremendous amount of excellent forecasting and modeling going on? What is the way that strategic foresight can actually come and add some value into this space? What is the missing piece in a way? And I think that the way we've been coming at it is that we're seeing that, hopefully, particularly as a result of COP26, we're going to be seeing a number of governments coming out with very ambitious declarations and commitments to achieving net zero around mid-century or before, shortly after. And they're increasingly going to have to translate that into credible, rigorous, actionable strategies for how to achieve that goal. And I'm very much hoping that the public is going to hold us all to account in terms of coming up with strategies that really are credible, but also that will potentially have the potential to prove successful under a variety of conditions and under the high uncertainty that we face. And that is really where we've come at it, by saying the decisions that we are going to need to be making now, that governments are going to need to be making, but also that financial institutions are needing to make as well, about where to invest, in what policies, in what areas of infrastructure development, and so forth. These are decisions that are needing to be made now, but that are going to be playing out over the coming 10, 20, 30 years, in which there's going to be a tremendous amount of change and a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And so what we really think the role that foresight can bring is saying, well, how can we explore some of the potential changes, both within the environmental space, but maybe even more importantly, outside of it, in the other systems, the other economic, social, technological, governance, geopolitical systems, the potential changes and disruptions there that could have an impact on our ability to really deliver and implement successful net zero transition strategies. And I want to come back to something that Daniel mentioned, which is really, there is one part of this, which is about sort of future-proofing and stress testing our strategies to help to make sure that what we have in place is not being sort of assuming that it's not built on expectations that the future is really going to look like the past, that we are expanding and getting ready for potential disruptions. But it's not only about identifying what the new challenges and dislocations to our strategy could be. It's also about very much opening up our minds to a broader range of possibilities that we could be both taking advantage of as new opportunities are created, but that we could also be building towards. So I think strategic foresight, very much in this qualitative space of imagining alternative scenarios about the future and what could happen in a variety of different systems and contexts is really also contributes to that broadening of the imagination that we will need. And we will need this on an ongoing basis, not just designing the strategies now, but continually as we're continuing to revise and update and adjust our strategies over time. So let me just, we go to the next slide, which is with the big table on it. You will see that this is some examples from the first part of our work here, where we've essentially identified, we're calling 30 initial possible disruptions for 2030 to 2050. And these, those of you familiar with Foresight will be familiar with the STEEP or STEEG categories. So we've identified potential changes in a variety of systems that could have a bearing on the effectiveness and success of net zero strategies. So just to give a couple of examples, we do in fact start with changes, the ones that we have, I believe here in orange in the middle, which are around changes in the environment itself. I mean, we know that many of the impacts of climate are going to be in the latter half of the century, even the next century. But as we've seen just in the summer of 2021 and other events in recent years, climate change is with us now, and we could be facing significant disruption across a range of ecological systems in the coming decades. And so one of the scenarios, we've looked at various dimensions of these, but one of them that kind of brings a number of tipping points together is we're calling hothouse Earth. And this is really what if by 2035, we're facing a number of coinciding tipping points on the environment all at once, whether it's heat waves and droughts and floods and so forth. And what would that mean for our ability to stay on track and keep the public's support for on track in our ongoing mitigation efforts? And really the initial findings we've had from talking through with colleagues workshopping this over the recent months has been just that, you know, there is a need for some significant investments in adaptation strategies, just as a means of keeping the mitigation strategies on target, and that there may even be a need to sort of look into testing potential responses such as geoengineering, so that if there is a significant pressure to engage in some of these, we're not caught ill prepared. So I think it really it's an example of what exploring one of these disruptions does, and it's the reflection in our thinking. But of course, we need to look beyond that too. And another example would just be the what we're calling here a more divided world. That is a lot of our assumptions that we're needing in here at COP26, and about what we're needing for success over the coming years and decades is really that unprecedented level of global collaboration to make this all work. And this is incredibly important. And yet there are signs that we may not be able to count on this, at least continuing even the kind of collaboration we've seen over the last decade. And so we need to be looking at some of those potential geopolitical transformations and what that could mean, and how one might then adjust one's strategies, or how we might, in foreseeing some of those challenges, be able to avert them as well. So those are some of the more obvious ones. But I now want to ask my colleague Dexter to turn to a couple of the more out-of-the-box potential disruptions that we're looking at that could be relevant.
Thanks so much. So I guess we're on to the next slide here. So in trying to push the envelope on this and make sure that we're not just picking off some of the low-hanging fruit disruptions like that divided world scenario, we've been exploring a few more of these. And so the first one that we want to talk about is about the possibilities of physical and cognitive limits of the human body not being the same over a couple decades out. So what if cognitive therapies, smart drugs, and brain-computer interfaces, to name a few things, increase the cognitive capacity and become available to at least some members of the population in most countries? So these are things that could greatly increase not only the length of lives, but the length of careers and productive years. And that could change economic dynamics substantially. But this could also bring things like greater career flexibility, which creates an opportunity for people to be more active in environmental reclamation and public works programs. And longer lives may increase people's incentive to engage in climate activism and related climate work. Other elements that we're looking at are there's big assumptions about how much technological progress we're going to see and how core that is to reaching net zero by 2050. But some of the questions that we want to ask are about how cybersecurity threats may grow to an extent that it slows down or reverses the extent of digitalization. So if cyber attacks are regularly carried out by increasingly numerous and capable state and non-state actors, this can overwhelm the defenses so that no digital space is safe, and there may be a large-scale return to analog systems. And we've seen some signs of this, but so this may change how we approach open research paradigms. That may change how much sharing of research is possible, and that may slow down innovation. And so that means that something like net zero, we have to be ready for a situation where it becomes much more dependent on reduced consumption and significant behavioral shifts instead of breakthroughs in various technology sectors or various elements of technology. And one of the third ones that we've been looking at for a long time now, that has gotten in the news a lot lately is what if there was more of life, more of the economy, more of work, more of how we connect with people takes place in digital and virtual spaces. This is to play out ideas around the metaverse and virtual reality, and to think through some of the major implications for all sectors of society. And that includes climate transitions. So the idea of working from anywhere enables mass migration to areas with high quality of life to cost of living ratios. This could add resilience in event of climate disasters such as flooding, and opens up new opportunities for urban planning and infrastructure that could be even more important policy levers in achieving sustainable and just transitions. There's also risks that remote work leads to migration to rural areas, which could threaten habitats and create gentrification and raise energy footprints in surprising ways. There's also an opportunity to harness virtual reality to provide well-being improvements and various forms of social connection that offset some of the sacrifices required by decarbonization, which Daniel mentioned before. If we're not getting on flights for business or pleasure travel, then there are ways that we can leverage technology to offset the loss. Those are just three of the many examples, but and if other people want to get involved, I think Duncan's going to tell us a little bit about that. But yeah, back to you, Duncan, and next slide.
Okay, thanks, Dexter. And so I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to maybe jump to the one further slide, which is the next steps one, and just say a couple of concluding remarks. So first of all, just to mention that our intention is not necessarily to be comprehensive about all of the potential disruptions and their implications. It's more to be really creating a sort of a proof of concept around the importance of taking into account a variety of potential disruptions from within and beyond the environmental system, and what that can mean, and hopefully spurring a range of kind of related work, both at the global level, but also within particular countries and regions, and within particular thematic areas as well. And so in terms of next steps, we really are hoping to both sort of refine our current list of disruptions, but really then to take this out and test this in a number of government contexts and with various organizations as well, and really expand that global dialogue around these issues. And so I guess the last message I'd say is that we're continually looking for partners to do that with. We're very happy to sort of organize joint workshops and events, or to collaborate on doing a kind of similar approach. But really, I think that this is an important contribution that we collectively in the Foresight community can bring to adding a level of sophistication and forward-looking to what we all need to be contributing now to really ensure that our net zero transition strategies are going to be successful under what is guaranteed to be a highly uncertain but very interesting future. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Duncan, Dexter, and yet again another illustration of how an organization like the OECD is tackling our futures and looking at them differently, and considering the many disruptions that we might be facing, looking not only at the risks. Often when we see disruptions, we run away, but also at the opportunities that go with them. And again, the power of imagination that is generated also by this exploration of the futures, as also highlighted by Daniel. But now let me turn to Susan Roth. You are at the Asian Development Bank. You are one of the leading development banks around that has integrated Foresight in what you are doing. And when looking at what Daniel, Duncan, Dexter presented, it seems quite a challenge to integrate all of that when you are a financial institution and particularly a development bank. How are you achieving all that? And what is the role of Foresight in what you are doing? Over to you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexis. If we can go maybe to the first slide. So maybe a bit of background. So we started to look at Foresight around 2016 in ADB, and this was in kind of the relation to a new strategy that we developed, the Strategy 2030 at that time. And at that time, what we realized is that a lot of our assumptions that go into that new Strategy 2030 were actually kind of the learning from the past. And we looked at what works, what doesn't, and it was very difficult, especially to convince people to do new things, because it was always this: have we done this before? Has anyone else done this? Has any other multilateral development bank done it? And at the same time, as you know, many of the multilateral development banks are full of economists, and they're used to forecasting using numbers, okay, where you kind of build models and extrapolate and so on. So we said, no, we need different tools. We really need to learn from the future. We have to use our imagination. And we started a very intense Future Foresight program where we started to train a few staff members on future thinking and foresight. Maybe to the next slide. To those of you who are not so future literate here, I think one example that always resonated very well with me, which is kind of the living example of the used future, as we call it, where we always use our past experience to think about how the future will look like, and then sometimes it all even looks like that, is the schools, right? If you look at, 100 years ago, we had the same kind of sitting orders in schools as we have in most public schools in the world. And still, even until today, if you look at the more traditional virtual learning environments that most students are exposed to. We are not talking about elite international schools. We're talking about the more traditional schools. So that is kind of this issue. How do we get away from this kind of used future? How do we create, and I think you said it, Daniel, the safe space for people to be, to use their imagination and play outside of the boundaries? And maybe you can go to the next slide, which is, I think, a good illustration for everyone when we start to realize that we really have to think outside the boundaries, and that often, the future sounds ridiculous, but that's what it has to sound, is if you look back in the past, when, we started with telephone and telecommunication, people said, well, why would we need that, right? We have people who can actually ride horses and bring messages. So this shows us that we will always have the kind of the weight of the past that pulls us down. And I think that's something that we have to be very aware of when we now think about strategies to reach net zero and to tackle the complexity of the climate crisis, which goes obviously, as Duncan has said, across various and multiple systems. And if we go to the next slide, please. It kind of is true from some research from a colleague of ours, Winnie Rohrbeck, that actually 82% of assumptions that we have that lead to strategies are misleading. And they are misleading because we use our past experience to build new strategies. And look at the last 20 months of COVID. Who would have thought, right, that we are still 20 months later in a similar situation? I mean, what kind of assumptions did we have to make some of the decisions, like, lockdowns and so on, where these assumptions actually right? So what I'm saying here is, let's use futures to check the assumptions that we use to build these strategies for our organizations and, with countries to reach the net zero situation. And if you can go to the next slide, please. I'll give you an example. I think what fascinated me personally the most, and what I find most powerful, is if you use, we have to go one slide back, please. If you use the tool of backcasting. So traditionally, right, you all know that, you use forecasting, you plan forward, you say this is today, this is in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. But if we use actually the tool of backcasting, which you can use, you can go to the next slide, please. You can see here the live stream is a bit delayed. So I can see it here now, is that you start with that vision in the future, a certain preferred scenarios or various scenarios. In this case, it would be, for example, that we do not want to have global warming beyond a certain level of degree, 2 or 1.5. And then you work backwards and say, what needs to happen to achieve that? And what are different kind of scenarios and futures that we can imagine. So in a way, it increases the level of ambition in that situation in the context of climate. But let's now give you a few examples so that you see what we've done in the past with some of the policymakers, and then I'll explain what we are doing in the bank right now. So if you can go to the next slide, please. We tested this. This is now not an example from climate change. It's an example from urban development. We tested these tools and worked with urban development counterparts and mayors in Armenia. And there we looked at urban development in Yerevan, and we developed different scenarios there. As you can see, no change scenarios, marginal change scenarios, adaptive change scenarios, and radical change scenarios. And through these scenarios and backcasting, then they identified some key milestones and activities, interventions that they could consider in their urban development planning and policies. And as you can see, it goes from, radical changes and even names for scenarios, which also help people to imagine, to create a narrative around the scenario, to create really a participatory process for people to agree on certain visions, on certain scenarios. We can go to the next slide, please, which is another example from Kazakhstan. And that was a fascinating discussion. They used future thinking and foresight tools to look at waste management. And just to give you here an example, how we worked with policymakers to create new kind of metaphors in the context of waste management in Kazakhstan. As you know, it's a fossil fuel rich country, where they basically said, well, with all this land that we have, we could actually become a waste management center. We could develop new tools, recycling tools, new industries. And waste is the new oil, and we shouldn't waste time, invest in waste. So it's a bit of a playful way to work with policymakers and development experts in countries to think about new possibilities related, obviously, to, in this case, urban development, economic development, waste management, recycling, but at the end linked to the climate agenda, which comes back to Duncan's point. We have to really look at these aspects in all policies. Future thinking and foresight creates an opportunity to create common grounds and different scenarios. So also people feel safe because they can play in these different scenarios, and we can test the assumptions. The next slide, please, which is, I think, another interesting tool. And when we all work, I think, on change, and even in our own organizations, or we have to introduce new ways, obviously, or the new climate strategies, new climate teams, I think what we often struggle with is the change management aspect. Because each of us are often, lethargic individuals, and embracing new ways of working, new ways of thinking, or even more radical ways to move forward, depends on our own narratives, on our world views and systems views. And this is where we work with tools like causal layered analysis to actually unpack that and create new narratives. This example here is from the People's Republic of China, and it was about the relationship with the Asian Development Bank and what they would like to see to leverage the knowledge work that we offer a bit more. So as you can see, while it is a scientific method and it's a good way to engage policymakers, it's also a good way to actually rejuvenate passion and imagination in individuals. And maybe we go now to the next slide. And while I gave you now these examples, I want to be more concrete and share what we are doing at the Asian Development Bank now. So we can go to the next slide already. We are working at 3 levels. The first one is the future thinking and foresight work that we do with developing member countries. And I gave you examples. And there it's really about vision alignment across different actors in development. It helps us to look at integrated approaches across various different sectors, from urban to environment to health, social sectors. And it helps us and also governments to overcome silos. So we believe this is particularly important, of course, for the climate agenda. We are working now increasingly also with partners, but normally the engagement is through partners, with partners, through workshops over a period of time. So it's really about familiarizing policymakers with future thinking tools. Next slide gives you an overview of where we've worked so far, in which countries. And we can see the appetite is really there. And back to the title of the actual presentation, which is future thinking and foresight a luxury? I think in the past, we've seen that mainly developed countries embrace future thinking and foresight, with obviously Canada, the US, Singapore, Finland being some of the leading countries, of course also Korea or Australia. But what we see now is that developing countries are embracing future thinking and foresight. So they want these new tools to imagine different scenarios, to have participatory approaches. Next slide, please. I think obviously what we all realize is, and I said this before, is while we can engage with our government counterparts, important is what changes inside the organization. And there we need a lot more work also, to break our silos, our sector silos, especially obviously for the climate agenda. So here we are now running comprehensive training programs on futures literacy at all levels, leadership level, at the specialist level, and create more thematic work areas to actually work together and imagine the future. We recently ran an immersive futures workshop over 3 months, which was online workshops related to work, and we worked on the climate agenda, on mental health and well-being, and on gender. And at the end, as you can imagine, all three were actually connected. The last slide now comes to partnerships and collaboration, and this is, I think, also why we are here. And thank you to Alexis and AFD and OECD for this invitation, is that we are seeing now that we as foresight and futures expert are coming closer together, and we are realizing we need to join forces and build a solid network of peer learners and practitioners, policy practitioners across the region. And we are partnering with various organizations, the Asia Pacific Futures Network, the UNESCO Futures Chairs in Asia, and we co-facilitate the OECD DAC Friends of Foresight Task Force on Foresight for Sustainable Development Finance. And that you see that other development banks are really embracing is I think, visible in this task force. But also last week, I had a call with the Islamic Development Bank, and they are already embracing future thinking and foresight in their analytical, in their economics work, actually, in their analytical work, and they're creating scenarios for economic development opportunities for recovery in very sensitive areas. They're speaking about mining and obviously textile industry and very carbon heavy industries, and looking at various scenarios and embracing these tools. The last slide, please, just to show you that a lot is happening in Asia and the Pacific. These are some of the futures, the UNESCO Futures Chairs, but I also want to mention specifically the work in Thailand with the Innovation Foresight Institute, the work in the Philippines with the Philippine Futures Society. The Senate in the Philippines created a working group of the Senate, the work in Malaysia, but also in Uzbekistan. So you can see that academia, think tanks, and policymakers are coming together to actually apply now future thinking and foresight in their policy work. As Daniel said, as you move to the future, it's becoming more and more uncertain. And I think this is where we need to support each other to make sure that these uncertainties, we can embrace these uncertainties and allow for strategies and approaches that look at multiple scenarios and allow for even sometimes diverse assumptions. So thank you very much. I do hope you're interested to learn more about ADB and futures work. If you show the very, very last slide, I think the key takeaways I already shared, but the very last slide, you can find some resources, or you just Google ADB, Future Thinking and Foresight. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Susan, for this comprehensive presentation, and impressive as well. And I was particularly impressed by what you said about what foresight, creating space for imagination and generating new narratives, how this can increase ambition. And this is so much needed these days in the discussions at COP26. And I was also very impressed to see how you're using Foresight also for your internal transformation as a tool to further transform our sometimes sectoral or thematic approaches in a complex world where we need to be much more holistic. And many thanks again for all of you for setting this stage. And I noticed that all of you mentioned imagination, narratives as being key elements to embed in all of what we do to be more future aware and to make a better use of the futures. So delighted to see that this conversation is taking place also in the financial sector world and within development banks and between development banks. And let's now maybe move to more concrete examples of situations encountered by different institutions in this area. And over to you, Ian, for the second part of the session.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexi. And of course, many thanks to our first round of speakers and panelists that I think have really helped kind of start paving that road from the bigger picture theory, which can get a little bit overwhelming when we're really thinking about rethinking everything, to actually how do you actually begin to channel that towards practical inputs into decisions that need to be made in the very much the near term. So what I'd like to do now is invite our panel to join the stage here, which of course is one person in the room. So Marcela, if you'd like to come up and join me on the stage. And then of course, I can introduce our panel overall. Let me just scroll to that place in my notes. Just so I don't make mistakes on titles, which I've been doing this whole COP. So first, of course, Marcela, who's joined us, who's a senior associate at the 2050 Pathways platform. We're then joined online by David Groves, senior climate change specialist at the World Bank. I'm also very happy, of course, to welcome Michel Cardona, another senior advisor from I4C Institute for Climate Economics, who will be saying a few words about work we've been doing in this area over the last few years. And then finally, a big welcome as well to Clément Péarol, economist, Climate Change Center, Banque de France, and also, of course, at the Secretariat of the Network of Central Banks and Supervisors for Greening the Financial System, NGFS. So I'm going to turn to Marcela to kick us off here with our panel. And again, talking about how they see this movement from kind of this big picture to actually now channeling and applying foresight scenarios and the different forms it can take, backcasting to what we're trying to achieve, which is, of course, climate finance, climate outcomes. So, Marcela, I think I need to give you this mic as this one. We can try it again. This one was maybe dead. Let's see. Perhaps just go ahead and give it a test. Oh, yeah, seems to be good. Perfect.
Working.
So, Marcela, over to you.
Right, thank you. And thank you to the initial panel. It was a very interesting couple of presentations. And as many of them mentioned, many countries are already committing to achieve net zero by 2050 or around 2050. And many of them are working on defining that long-term strategy that will help them achieve that target. So we have already 42 long-term strategies submitted. And we know that there are around 80 countries that are right now working on designing that long-term strategy. And when you are talking about such a long time frames for planning, of course, this big question of uncertainty starts to arise. And it can be sometimes overwhelming aspect of how do you go about doing this long-term strategy and how, as a government, you are able to deliver something that will be trusted by the society and by everyone behind that, right? So we're starting to see actually some countries to start applying this kind of tools to inform the strategy so it's robust and it can have people behind that. And therefore, it can be implemented and drive these investments, right? And we've seen some examples. For example, we've seen Tonga already using this kind of work for doing different analysis of futures to inform the strategy. And that has helped them to get a lot of people around this work. But particularly, we have seen many countries in Latin America taking a very interesting approach of using robust decision-making to inform the long-term strategies. And this has been mostly done through a project led by the Inter-American Development Bank, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Latin America and the Caribbean project, where we, the platform, are a partner. And we have seen this applied to Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica. Some of them already submitted the long-term strategy. And this has been a very interesting process of applying robust decision-making and the deep uncertainty to inform that. And so I want to share with you 5 main kind of takeaways that we have seen from those processes in those countries that have applied these methods. So first, I think it's very important to highlight the use of these methods enable to capture multiple points of view. And I think this was already mentioned by some of the panelists. So what you are able to do throughout this process is to really listen to the different actors, because we know climate cuts across all sectors of the economy, across different levels of society. So you really need to have a way of listening to all of them and to capture that information and to be able to use it as part of the analysis, not just to listen, but to really make it part of the analysis and the process. So it's really a tool that enables that conversation and to build the trust around the process. And particularly something that someone else mentioned is that it helps to have a long-term strategy that is not only about GHG emission reduction and just getting to net zero regardless of any other development objective. It's a process that enables you to capture what are the other socioeconomic development objectives that the society and the sectors have that we can integrate in this objective of decarbonizing. So it's a way to get everybody behind this vision of development. It's not GHG emission reduction regardless, right? So that is a very important element to make those long-term strategies something that is viable and something that is a country vision. So definitely very useful on that point of view. Second, it really enables to clarify what are the critical issues that require greater attention. And I think this was already mentioned in one of the presentations, how do you find actions that are successful in different conditions? How do you are able to evaluate those actions that you can do now that will always kind of result in different conditions on being beneficial? And which of those are quite difficult. Maybe there are some actions that are not quite clear that is always going to be a win. And so what this helps to the governments is to help to prioritize political policy and financial efforts on those areas that seem really critical. Because when we're talking about transforming a whole economy, there are so many areas that need to be transformed, need to be moved. Some of them may require particular attention, and that is very important to help to focus not only government efforts, but also international support. So that is also something very helpful of applying these kind of methods to the design of those long-term strategies. There is also something very useful, and I particularly find that this is super useful, which is about being able to talk about specific levers. And this means policy levers, but also specific actions, instead of just talking about GHG emission reductions. Because when we're just talking about 20% emission reduction in one sector, or I don't know, just talking about GHG in general, it's quite difficult to start really translating in what it means in terms of the actions, in terms of the technologies, in terms of the policy. And once you're able to translate into that terms, then the financing becomes a little bit more clear, because you know what kind of technologies, what kind of context, what kind of scale, what kind of time frame you are talking about. So I think that's a very important element, particularly for the financial conversation. The fourth element is the idea of co-designing. This was also mentioned, but the process really brings people together around this conversation of listening to each other and trying to find the solutions and the possible pathways towards that end goal together. And that is a very important element to be able to build the political viability of those visions. Not only, obviously, the technical and financial, but the political one, which is a critical element to that. And in that co-design, it's also very interesting to see the different areas of different communities coming together, particularly the policymakers, the academic coming through together to join forces to inform this and to really make something that is quite actionable and can also bring in the voices of the practitioners, the different sectors that are doing businesses, etc. So it really brings the people around this co-designing of what is this strategy, what is this vision that we want to achieve, and what are we worried about, how we consider those in this strategy, right? And the fifth element, last one, is, and this is a particular focus of this project that was done by the IDV and where we collaborated, and is this focus on building the local capacity. Because we are going to need to keep revising this, because we need to then check how the future actually happened, which were like those that were more close to our initial assumptions. Do we need to revise anything? And it's very important that, particularly in the developing countries, they continue to rely a lot on the capacity existing in, for example, European and other universities and knowledge on this area. And it's very important that the local capacity stays in the country, in local universities, in local think tanks, so the government can turn around quickly and try to evaluate different changes and conditions in the local context. So that's definitely something very important to keep throughout this transition, and something that is, I think, very important for the international community to support. Finally, just a note that this work that we have seen, particularly in Latin America and Chile, Costa Rica already have the Longterm strategy submitted, very, very interesting work there. I think Colombia will have that soon as well, and Peru as well. It's very focused on the decarbonization side. The countries, they have also been starting working on the adaptation side. That's also the case, for example, for Chile, for Colombia, and others. And they are also looking at how to use these kind of tools, like robust decision-making and the deep uncertainty, to evaluate and to make those policies and goals and plans robust, bring the society around them. And we think this is definitely an area where more work could be done to really evaluate those impacts on their resilience sides, because we know that as there are more and more extreme weather events coming to countries, this is really affecting more and more the capacity to respond and to build back better, like we say this quite often, but that really affects their capacity to come back. So it is important to include this element of resilience and to expand on this work that we have been seeing in some of the countries.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcela, both bringing in that very essential part of it. Again, not just focusing on the mitigation side, but bringing in the adaptation, resiliency, and that impact on that capacity afterwards to respond. But I also think in drawing out that, again, when we're talking about taking uncertainty into account, it's not about making a scenario. It's more than a scenario. It's more than a document. It's more than backcasting, it's a process. And I think the 5 points that you've laid out here really start to help flesh out what that process needs to look like in order to provide useful insights that aren't just useful for a single question, but really, again, moving an entire strategy forward. I'm going to pick up on the point the term you used, which was robust decision-making under deep uncertainty, which I'm going to turn to David, who's joining us online, as I know this is a term that the World Bank is also using, and we'd be interested to hear how the World Bank has been taking, again, uncertainty into account and attempting to ensure that robustness of decisions under deep uncertainty. So let me just move the slides forward 1 second, and David, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian and Alexi, for convening this exciting event. It's so great to hear how Foresight is being used to think about climate action and guide the financing of the needed decarbonization transition. So as mentioned, my name is David Groves. I'll be discussing briefly how the World Bank Group is using decision-making under deep uncertainty and robust decision-making to support its activities. So let me first thank Daniel, Duncan, Dexter, and Suzanne for the Foresight overview, and also to Marcela for introducing robust decision-making and its use in developing long-term strategies. I'd like to turn this. Which slide is on? Oh, great, thank you. I'd like to just expand on this a bit by just bringing in other related methods. We sometimes group these under the umbrella of decision-making under deep uncertainty, and I'd argue that robust decision-making, adaptation pathways, Foresight, are all examples of deep uncertainty, decision-making under deep uncertainty. And these are as motivated by the other speakers. These methods are all focused on making decisions when there are conditions of deep uncertainty. So just to mention, just to be clear on what that means, we often define that as when parties to the decision can't agree on external factors or trends on how a system works, or even what is most important. This is a definition from Rob Lempert from RAND. Another definition is, deep uncertainty arises from actions taken over time in response to unpredictable evolving situation, This is from Marline Hasnett at Deltares. So, the choices that multilateral development banks and others are, make when supporting development and seeking to eradicate poverty, they're all complicated by deep uncertainty. Answering the basic questions of which project should be financed, for example, given that their effects over time will be influenced by all these different uncertain factors, is a really important example. So DMDU methods support policymakers, by providing mostly quantitative frameworks for evaluating how decisions could perform under a wide range of uncertain futures. And we've heard a lot about that in the use of scenarios. And then identifying those strategies or decisions that are robust to that uncertainty, and that often involves more quantitative methods and tools. This requires or often uses models to not forecast the future, but to play out many what if scenarios of what could happen, and then support a participatory dialogue around trade-offs. So the World Bank Group has been an early supporter and developer of methods for DMDU. World Bank co-organized and hosted the first annual meeting of the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty back in 2013. It's developed and published some of the first case studies that applied these methods to water management shortly after. And it's continued to use these methods, often robust decision making, for select studies relating to climate impacts in the water sector and others. For those of you who are new to this area, you can actually download a free book that came out in 2019 that's shown on the screen. You just Google Springer DMDU, and this has a lot of examples and references a lot of the related methodologies that are being applied worldwide on this topic. Next slide. So more recently, however, the use of DMDU is becoming more pervasive and central to World Bank's activities. Some of you may have heard about the World Bank's resilience rating system. This is a new approach to support adaptation and resilience considerations in the project design. And it essentially provides project teams at the bank with a set of guidelines and tools to evaluate how resilient a project is. And we call this the resilience of the project, as well as how much a project contributes to the overall resilience of a system or community, and we call this resilience through the project. The picture on the right depicts that an increasingly better grade is achieved by essentially applying more and more DMDU concepts. So these scenario tools that we've been discussing today. So a C, for example, is received when the project has been screened for climate and disaster risk, essentially identifying that climate uncertainties could be a factor. But to earn a B in a project, the project also needs to conduct a risk assessment and consider adaptation options. And finally, an A is earned when the project performs a full DMDU style vulnerability assessment and includes contingencies that ensure economic viability across a range of features. So the World Bank is pilot testing this approach across the bank and is committed to using this approach going forward to ensure that the bank is financing projects that are aligned with climate resilience objectives. Next slide. And the World Bank is also using DMDU to support long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, or LTSs, that Marcelo was speaking of and others. Just to elaborate on that, as depicted on the right by the now famous figure from IPCC's assessment of a 1.5 degree future, there are many pathways to net zero emissions. We're not going to be able to predict what we should do and how we should get there with precision now. Rather, we're going to, we need to set our long-term targets and think about the many ways we can achieve that and pick a path that's going to succeed, even though there are all sorts of uncertainties related to economic development trends, pandemics, cooperation on decarbonization, technology advances, prices, availability, even the way that the natural system will respond to all of those forces. I think Duncan and Dexter provide a great overview of other potential disruptions. I really appreciated that framing. So the World Bank is using DNDU and robust decision making in 3 ways around this topic of long-term strategies. First, we are supporting deep country engagements, and this is very much in line with what Marcella mentioned about sort of the value of these methods in helping build local capacity and support the decisions and the choices that must be made at the country level to really decarbonize. Second, we're developing tools and methods and bringing together tools and methods developed by others as well to apply to the development of long-term strategies. And these tools will look at evaluating many pathways to decarbonization, moving beyond just sort of business as usual and 1 or 2 projections of where a country could go to reach net zero, but rather looking at a wide range of possible pathways and how uncertainty affects those pathways. And this allows the strategy to be much more cognizant of the risks and the vulnerabilities and discuss trade-offs and ways to manage that. And lastly, the World Bank is collaborating with other multilateral development banks to scale up capacity and also 2050 pathways and other partners. So to scale up the ability of the overall community to support all those countries that really need to think critically about how its development plans with decarbonization in mind, and provide the support that's going to be needed over the coming years to ensure that all countries are proceeding in a way that is more consistent, hopefully completely consistent with Paris alignment. So with that, I will stop, and I look forward to answering questions and discussing the topic more in a moment. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, David. I think it's really interesting to see the different ways, again, both across the resiliency question and around mitigation and other forms, long-term strategy. Of course, long-term strategies do more than mitigation, or they should in practice. So I won't say that, but definitely to see those applications by the World Bank. What I'd like to do is maybe change gears slightly now by moving to my colleague Michelle from I4C, because in some sense, it's not just about the scenarios themselves or the long-term strategies, particularly when we're looking at this from the more risk side of things and taking into account the different climate-related risks, whether physical or transition, that countries or different actors might be faced with. There's also a need to think about futures and the different way of, again, taking into account that uncertainty. So, Michelle, if I could hand things over to you, to say a few words about the piece of work I4C published now a couple of years back, and then, of course, where some of that thinking is going and where we might seeing it showing up today. So Michelle. Oh, I think you're going to need to unmute yourself real quick. Great, yeah, perfect.
Sorry. Thank you, Jan, and thank you for the invitation to this very interesting event. As Jan said, my short presentation will be based on a policy paper that I4CE published a couple of years ago, whose title was Towards an Alternative Approach in Finance to Climate Risks, Taking Uncertainties Fully into Account. And contrary to what Marcella and David just said, our focus was more on a private financial institution, more specifically on banks. Next slide, please. So there is a paradox. Climate change is clearly creating climate-related risks. There is no doubt about it. But there is a deep uncertainty regarding the pace, the shape, and the magnitude of these risks. The 3 sources of radical uncertainties are well known. I will not go into detail about that. There are scientific uncertainties due to the complexity of a climate system. There are the natural variability of climate with non-linear behavior of climate in particular. And most importantly, there are socioeconomic uncertainties. So because we don't know exactly yet what will be the transition pathway to the low carbon economy we are all striving for. In this context, what we see, what we know, is that standard risk management tools are based on historical data and on assumption of normal distributions. And they are backward looking. And so they are facing several challenges to integrate these climate risks. The lack of distribution of risks, that's most important issue, but also the incompatible time horizons between the climate change and these risk assessment tools, the lack of granular data, and also difficulties to represent the disruption, the dynamics. Next slide, please. So in this context, there is a broad consensus among the financial community to put in place a forward-looking approach. So the question is, which approach? And the idea behind the paper was to look at whether the framework of decision-making theory in an uncertain world that both Marcella and David have presented already, although this DNDU approach could provide an alternative approach for making a decision in this context of a financial institution, and especially in the context of banks. We have already heard explanation about these methods. These methodologies do not try to model risk, contrary to what standard risk management methods do. They explore a diversity of possible future and assess the performance of different management options with regard to this diversity. So contrary to the scenario analysis, the aim is not to identify a small number of relevant scenarios, but to look at variance to show the dynamics of risk transmission and the way the system responds to them. And this assessment is carried out with a particular focus on two criteria complementary to performance. On the one hand, adaptability, and on the second hand, robustness. And we have different methods, dynamic adaptation pathways, robust decision-making that have already been presented quickly. Next slide, please. So the question was to see whether there was a possible adaptation to finance, and to see whether these approaches, which were initially developed for large-scale infrastructure projects, were able to assess financial institution decision based on multiple scenarios with no probability assigned. Due to the amount of data and due to the intense analysis which are needed, which need to be deployed within these approaches, these approaches are not suited to all decision making processes, and in particular, they don't seem to be usable for day-to-day asset management or standard lending decisions. So the idea was to explore other possibilities and to see whether these approaches could be more suited to other types of decision, such as financing of specific and large assets, for instance, infrastructure projects, which is probably the most direct and straightforward application. It has already been used in some development banks. whether it could be used as well for the management of long-term investment portfolios, for instance, the choice of investment universe, or whether it would be usable for asset and liability management, for instance, to calibrate the level of capital required to in banks to face climate risks. In other words, the idea was to see whether it could be usable for long-term and strategic decisions. Next slide, please. So what is the current status of play? Well, this avenue has not really been explored either by the academic community or financial institutions for private commercial institutions. We have seen that, on the contrary, DFIs have been developing and using these methods. I will not go in more detail about that. And in a private financial institution, what we have seen is that priority has been given to other options. Scenario analysis, as recommended by financial regulators and the TCFD, more qualitative approaches, such as a climate risk score or transition rating, and still attempts have been carried out to try to integrate climate-related risk into standard risk management tools. So looking forward, what we can say. First, the measure of credit-related risks seem out of reach for a while. And so the integration into standard risk management tool is out of reach as well. Second, scenario analysis, which has been given a lot of attention, is a useful tool, but difficult to use in isolation. So that's the reason why we still continue to think that there could be, still be worth exploring another option, which would mix scenario analysis with these non-financial approaches, with these exploratory approaches, to focus on robustness and adaptability of some long-term and strategic decisions in commercial banks. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Michel, and for providing those insights on the state of practice today, both in terms of thinking and then, of course, and the different options, as well as really what we see going on, particularly among commercial financial institutions. And I think that's a perfect segue into our final speaker. I think, oops, that's the wrong way. Let me just try to pop backwards real quick to Clément from the NGFS, who will be, of course, speaking a little bit more about, what's going on in terms of the, let me just bring it back, sorry, trying to get it back to our original slide. What's going on in terms of this from the point of view of regulators of the financial sector, as well as central banks. So Clément, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to all previous panelists. I will try not to repeat those very insightful remarks, and especially I think the NGFS scenarios that I'm going to present are very much in line with what Michel just mentioned. So it's a perfect transition. So as you might be aware, the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, is a group of 100 central banks and supervisors willing to foster the assessment and management of climate-related risks, and to promote green finance as well. So in the NGFS, we are convinced that climate change brings risks to financial and price stability, and that central banks and supervisors must assess and manage them in a forward-looking manner, given that, as Michel just said, past data are a poor guide to future climate risks. And in face of the uncertainty that was discussed earlier, we need to consider a wide range of plausible futures. And given that climate scenarios are complex to develop and interdisciplinary and difficult to compare to one another, this is why many central banks and supervisors came together in the NGFS and worked with the best climate scientists and modelers, including some working for the IPCC, to develop climate scenarios, first for central banks and supervisors, but also for the wider financial sector, and increasingly for other actors as well. So those scenarios enable us to assess the risks in the financial system and identify what action are required to mitigate them. So actually, our latest report showed that 31 NGFS members have engaged in climate scenario analysis so far, and many of them involve financial institutions in the process to raise awareness and improve expertise on climate issues, also among financial institutions. So what the NGFS scenarios show is that we have an opportunity to reach a successful transition to net zero emission by 2050. But this transition can occur in an orderly way, or if it is managed poorly, it could be disruptive for our economies. And moreover, if the transition fails, global warming will cause huge physical damages. So the NGFS developed 6 scenarios falling in those 3 categories to assess both transition and physical risks until the end of the century in a variety of futures. So in particular, in the last vintage of the scenarios that was released last June, we included a net zero 2050 scenario. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have, for instance, a scenario where only current policies are kept in place. The NGFS scenarios provide many pathways for many variables, including macro-financial information, the evolution of our energy system, the evolution of climate, including warming and extreme weather events. And variables are available at the country level or even regional level for some of them, which makes it useful for many countries. And in particular, the scenarios give a sense of what the transition to net zero means in practice. For instance, we will need to draw roughly 75% of our energy needs from renewables by 2050. And to achieve that, global carbon prices will need to be much higher. And NGFS scenarios show that if the transition to net zero is managed well, it could have benefits for growth as well. But of course, we should also prepare for some physical risks. On the other hand, the scenarios also inform us on what will happen if no action is taken to mitigate climate change. We will see, for instance, an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events and a loss of labor productivity due to warming, for instance. So finally, just a few words on how we have dealt with the uncertainties in our climate scenarios. So we have, as I just said, designed the scenarios explicitly in a way that allows users to navigate these uncertainties. So as I said, there are 6 scenarios allowing users to explore a variety of plausible futures. And for each scenario, we used 3 underlying integrated assessment models to show ranges of results from several models. So that's how we dealt with uncertainty in the scenarios, and we are also very transparent about it. And we, in our report, we also explain where the uncertainty lies in our results. And just a word in terms of the next steps, the NGFS is committed to enhance further and update the scenarios as well. So, for instance, we are trying to deepen the sectoral granularity of the scenarios and improve our modeling of physical risks. So this will be included in a new vintage of the scenarios that we expect to be released next summer. So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any question.
Great. Thank you, Clément, so much for providing those insights into the thinking behind, of course, what NGFS has been doing in this space, the 6 scenarios, and then also, of course, how uncertainty is going into it. And I think definitely starting to indicate where progress is made. As Michelle said, we're no longer taking as much of a backward looking. We're thinking about this differently, trying to really open up the way that uncertainty is being done, but also the challenge of then trying to roll this out, let's say, at an industrial scale out to the entire financial sector to be used within the different supervisory and regulatory exercises that they must be involved with, or as well, of course, to inform more strategic thinking. We unfortunately are down to about 2 minutes left in our event. As we've seen, this kind of overview of where these topics are coming from, the theory all the way to practice, has shown that there's a lot going on and that we probably could have doubled the length of the event in order to do this. So unfortunately, I may have said that time has made me a liar and I'm not able to actually take questions from the room or from the online room. But I definitely think we've seen a broad number of points where we definitely see space to move forward and continue this conversation beyond just, of course, this event that we're doing today, and how we can begin to dig a little bit more into depth moving forward. Before perhaps I hand things over to Alexi to close the discussion, again, panelists, apologies, we can't really provide a space to react because I'm sure there's quite a bit we could discuss. I, of course, do want to thank all of our panelists. Also as well to IDFC for hosting our event today, to AFD for our partner, and then of course to the Secretariat team, Alice Potier, and everyone else who's provided the insights in constructing this program that has been almost a year in making, and it's really great to again see bringing all these different voices together, and hopefully now we can see how to move forward. And I think, Alexi, you'll close things out by perhaps saying a few words on how we'll be able to do that.
Thanks, Ian. And indeed, I mean, there's no conclusion on such a brilliant exchange and presentations about the importance of integrating and making a better use of the futures. What I have heard from many of you is that this is a key topic, an essential topic that the financial system at large is starting to embrace, and we have already concrete examples of that, but it's just the beginning, and there's much more to be done to move from a situation where the illusion of control was dominating to a situation where we better embrace uncertainty and even celebrate it. I have heard some of you mentioning that, so as to increase ambition and help transform ourselves and the way we finance things. So in order to continue the conversation, there are several places where you can join and partner. One of them is, of course, the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions initiative that will certainly continue providing a space to develop the discussions around how climate finance can better integrate futures and uncertainty. And there's another space that I mentioned quickly at the beginning, which has just been set up with the support of the Finance in Common movement, and that's the Task Force on Foresight for Sustainable Development Finance that is hosted by the OECD DAC Friends of Foresight community, and that the Asian Development Bank and ourselves are honored to be co-facilitating these days. And in those two spaces, I think you would be more than welcome, and we will be continuing offering the possibility to dig more into all of what has been discussed today. And again, when you think about what is the role of finance in this world, in the end, what is its social responsibility? If it is about connecting us to our futures, then finance needs to be much more future aware, and we need this collective effort that we've seen today to continue to make that happen. And we at AFD are strong believers that this conversation needs to continue. And we are so happy to see that this is a broader movement that is also picking up regulators and organizations like the OECD and policymakers. So no closing statement, just the beginning of much more to come. And let's enjoy our futures, which will be very different and with plenty of ambition. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alexi. And I think just on that last note, a reminder that tomorrow, no, November 10th, is that tomorrow? Yes, that is tomorrow. Don't know what day it is anymore. Second week of COP. So tomorrow, on November 10th, the OECD will be holding, I think, an online side event, future-proofing net zero transition strategies, probably building on quite a bit of what we've already heard from the OECD and others today, from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. via their online platform. So if you do want to follow up with us quickly or with the OECD more quickly, that's one way to do it. So thanks, everyone. Perhaps a round of virtual and in-person applause for our panelists and our speakers, and we look forward to engaging with you soon. Have a great afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you may be.
Thank you.
Thank you.